London Politica podcast. This is where we join industry thought leaders and experts to uncover the nexus of politics, markets, and society. My name is Chawla, and the guest joining me today is, in many ways, Marine Le Pen's worst nightmare. Joining me from Paris is Dr. Catherine Fieschi, who is the founder and director of Counterpoint, a consultancy that helps organizations navigate a new age of political and social risks. She's also the celebrated author of her 2019 book, Populocracy, The Tyranny of Authenticity, and The Rise of Populism. Dr. Fieschi, it is so wonderful to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So I want to kind of begin where you began in the book. You first sort of met JeanMarie Le Pen after, was it sort of 18 months of trying to reach out to the right person? I just, what did that interaction teach you? How did you go about meeting him? What was that like?
So, at the time, I was a postgraduate student. I was writing my PhD, and I was writing my PhD for McGill University, so North American institution. And I remember saying to my supervisor that I really, really felt that it was very difficult to write about populism without actually meeting populist leaders, because populism certainly doesn't boil down to a type of leadership. There's more to it than that, but still you kind of need to understand what these people are like. So I tried very, very hard to meet him, and I have to say that it was one of those experiences. I met him several times. I met him probably about a dozen times as I researched my PhD, and I think the biggest there were two big takeaways. One takeaway was that interacting with such political personalities is absolutely key to understanding their worldview, right? Including the fact that they don't listen to you, they don't care what you ask, they are absolutely on their own track. But the other real key takeaway was that their worldview and the way they talk about it is made up of a lot of lies, right? It was one of the really shocking things to me that, he would tell me one thing at one meeting, and then he would completely contradict himself in the next. And and I was I was much younger, and I was a little bit shy about saying, but I don't understand, that's not what you said last time. And if I did, he just brushed it away. And it was a real insight that stayed with me for all my work afterwards, which is that one of the great differences between us loosely called, liberals, and people like JeanMarie Le Pen that we loosely label populists, is that they don't have the qualms that we have about lying and manipulating. For them, it's part of the game. It's part of the trade. So whereas we would be embarrassed about being caught out, they feel absolutely no embarrassment at all, and the end justifies the means.
Yeah. It's so fascinating because I was, interviewing some people when I was doing my dissertation, and there's always the struggle between who I'm interviewing and the difference in our political opinions, but how to square that to sort of reach anything useful I could get from them. And it's probably not unreasonable to say that JeanMarie Le Pen is, a racist, an anti-Semite, possibly a fascist, and I assume your political opinions are at least a little bit different from his. Did that ever, was that ever cause for tension between the two of you, or did that hinder your work at all? Or
I think it wasn't cause for tension because he wasn't particularly worried about what I thought about him. I was a young PhD student, but very occasionally, I'd ask him a question or I'd make a remark, and then he'd pause and laugh. And several times he said to me, I don't understand, Catherine, how can an intelligent young woman like you be left wing? So it was quite interesting that he was very well aware that we really did not have the same political opinions, but I wasn't I wasn't on his political radar. He didn't really care very much about that.
Very cool. And he, some might say, sort of the heir of this counter-revolutionary sort of pre-World War II, post-World War II political right movement. And then one might sort of extend that lineage and say Marine Le Pen is the heir to her father's politics. And then I'm wondering how you feel, how she sort of adapted how she A, carries the same sort of some political elements, or and B, has adapted some of those to sort of the current environment. And essentially, how different is she from Jean-Marie Le Pen?
Um, so I've been, I've met her a couple of times, and one of the first times I've met her, and I've chronicled this in other places, was in a, it was actually a bit odd, in the sense that I was interviewing him at his home, and she came in, wanted to show him a clip of somebody who was part of a documentary, and who was this elderly Algerian gentleman who was accusing Jean-Marie Le Pen of having tortured him. So it was a very bizarre moment of being the three of us, watching this interview. And both of them were laughing, right? And this is when that, you're really in the presence of people whose norms and values are really not, really not your own. And at the time, I remember thinking that she was as ruthless as her father, and that, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and et cetera, et cetera. I have to say that, since she's taken over the party, I mean, a lot of what she's done has been about mainstreaming the image of the party. And so obviously she's toned down a lot of things. But I also think that, she's a woman and of a different generation. And there are simply some things that, beyond whether or not she thinks they will play out or not play out, with their potential supporters or their supporters. I think there are just some things that she has moved beyond, right? Just because of her age and because of her gender. So, for example, I don't actually think she's bothered at all about, same-sex marriage or homosexuality. I really, this is not something that she's particularly been vocal on. I don't think that, she's particularly anti-Semitic, in the way that her father was, in that kind of, deeply right-wing conservative French way that you still had, well after the Second World War, and which is part, alas, of French political culture. I actually think she is, not that. I don't think she is like that. But on the other hand, I think other things, have come to the fore with her, particularly Islam, right? So, so the mainstreaming is also figuring out what plays with her current audience. And, she, and I'm sure this, she really set out to broaden the appeal of the party when she took over in 2011. So instead of just looking at, people who were anti-immigration, anti-Islam, essentially, racist and xenophobes, she broadened the appeal out to basically, to ordinary people who felt they were being hard done by, and basically she started targeting lower income voters, and particularly lower income voters in parts of France, particularly northern France, in vastly deindustrialized areas, right? So for those people, she was obviously, playing up a different set of a different set of issues. So I don't think, I don't think she's a much more palatable human being, but I do think that, she is fundamentally different from her father. And let's face it, they are not on good terms. And I don't think that's just for the cameras. I think that there are a lot of things on which they disagree, which explains, the huge rift between them.
Mm. I mean, so speaking of kind of your personal encounters with them, I can kind of gauge this quite apparent sense of, even in their personal lives, this sort of brazenness. Not really. Presumably, they knew you might write about these things, and they could laugh about this documentary in front of you, or they could lie in front of you very sort of blatantly. It seems like the sort of aspect of their personal lives carries, a sort of image of, saying what you want and saying it carries into the political. And when I kind of contrast that with, the United States, some people look at the same quality in Trump and say that's the reason we voted for him. And analysts look at that and say, it's a bit of an act. And you can kind of see the act falter sometimes, this whole sort of I will say anything I want, and I don't care about anyone else's opinion, and that sort of, sentiment and the way they portray themselves. But it seems less so maybe that's, the case with the Le Pens. Would you sort of agree with that?
I think that there's a number of things. One is that, when Jean-Marie Le Pen was on the rise, particularly the 1980s, where he was, his political power really increased, and they got a few seats in the National Assembly in 1986, and then there was this kind of constant rise. His biggest gripe was the fact that he never got, that nobody wanted to speak to him, and that he didn't get enough airtime, that the media was biased against him, and so on and so forth. That's one of the reasons why he was willing to talk to somebody like me, who made no bones about the fact that, I was really not at all, on the same political level as he was, right? But for him, there was no such thing as bad publicity. He was desperate for publicity, and one way to do that was, to be big and bold and brash, and to say outrageous things, and to pretend to have slipped up when in fact you hadn't really slipped up. You'd meant to be, to be outrageous. And it is worth remembering that we're talking about the 1980s. This was a long time ago. He in some ways, somebody like him, paved the way for the Trumps and the Farages, and and even on the other side, the Beppe Grillos on left populists in Italy, and Salvini. I mean, he really was a vanguard, and to do that, he had to be incredibly bombastic, right? And I don't know how much of it, is an act, even in terms of the other populists. One of the things, it goes back to the lying. One of the things that I'm convinced about is that, being really brazen about the fact that you're lying is an incredibly effective way for a Trump, for example, or or a Salvini, etc. It's an incredibly brazen way of saying, I really don't care about your liberal norms, about truth, about your liberal, political mainstream. I don't care who I offend, and actually, I think that there's something quite, attractive to some people. Somebody who's, kind of winking and saying, I'm lying, I'm lying, I know that I'm lying. And in a sense, the subtext is I'm willing to blow all the norms out of the water to prove to you that I'm actually on your side. I'm just an ordinary person. We all lie, and it's quite a, I think it's quite a sobering thought, because this is a politician who's not saying, I'm a good person, or I'm an ordinary person. I'm a good man, like other good men. Basically, Trump is saying, I'm just as bad as the worst of you are. Who's going to throw the first stone?
Mm.
And I think, it's a bit scary that it works. So maybe an act, but it's a really effective act.
Very, very interesting way of thinking about it, especially I think because it sort of symbolizes how bad the polarization, the political polarization is. Because at least until you'd say 2008 times, you everyone would agree the truth is the ultimate value, and the left and the right are different ways of approaching it, and but you wouldn't sort of disagree on that. It's seeming to me for the first time that even that isn't something the left and right, and or maybe the left and right is a long way of categorizing this, but the sort of populist and whatever the other side is can't agree on the value of the truth. And when you're at the kind of fringes, and it's so politically polarized, it kind of makes sense why certain parts of these political parties would reach out to similar parts in other countries and try to
Yeah.
establish these kind of transnational alliances almost. And to me, there's like a weird, ironic, almost cosmopolitanism to that when the populist right does it. When Marine Le Pen tries to do something with Vox, or
Yeah.
with some sort of something with Orban in Hungary, or the Steve Bannon and Hungary, and there's weird connections there. What's the value of that for these leaders, would you say?
So I think it's really important, and I was writing about it recently because I've never been particularly convinced by their attempts at, creating international ties, right? And there's something, there was something quite paradoxical about these parties and party leaders who, the one thing they have in common is they're all nationalists, right? Whatever else, on whatever other measure they may differ, most of these populists, you'd say, well, they're nationalists. And so if you're a nationalist, that doesn't make you particularly well equipped to cooperate with others across national divides. And we've seen this in European elections. There's the European elections take place. It's always the same thing. Then there's a strong vote for the far right or the populist right, depending on which country you're talking about. And then everybody says, oh my God, what if they band together, right? And then they try and band together, and it's a complete mess. It's a complete mess. I mean, I remember not after the last 2019 elections, but the elections in 2014. It was so funny. They were insulting each other, and they were, accusing each other of being fascists and of being Nazis. And, it was a surreal scene. So I never really believed that they would coalesce, but something's changed here. Last month in May, the Conservative Party Conference, the U.S. Conservative Party Conference, CPAC, held its meeting in Hungary, right? This makes me slightly uneasy, with Fox News behind it, and they had Bolsonaro's son from Brazil attend, and Marine Le Pen didn't go, but she sent her acting, in a sense, the acting party chair at the moment. Trump sent messages and so on. And I think that one of the things that's changed is that they are all realizing the value of a big media network. There's this thinking now in Europe that they need the equivalent of Fox News. That's the instrument that they're missing to be effective on a European-wide scale. And I also think the other thing is money, right? And it's Russian money that's gone to Orban. It's Russian money that's gone to Marine Le Pen, and it's a lot of money being channeled through American channels, into Europe via Hungary, because now obviously Russia is much more complicated for that. So I think we are potentially, I'm not saying it's 100% certain, but we are potentially at a point, where I'm slightly alarmed that, this connection across the Atlantic, but also across with the Americas, is starting to occur with a lot more money and more media savvy involved. I'm hoping I'm wrong, but I detect a shift.
Yeah. With the kind of emphasis you place particularly on big media, there seems to be an emphasis on perceptions and the optics of things. And so I think when people say Marine Le Pen has really tried to mainstream her party in order to gain the vote, I might look at that and say, it's the mainstreaming in the optics of it, but not necessarily in the actual policies that she espouses. And it's a different haircut, it's a different way of posing in pictures, or posing with the different people, or arguing for things slightly differently, or maybe appealing to a broader voter base. But like the fundamental nuts and bolts of what she's advocating doesn't seem to have changed that much. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with you. I kept saying to people who talked about her mainstreaming, and it's true, the image has been mainstreamed, the language has been mainstreamed, but basically what it is that, she's become smarter about what you can say on primetime television, right? And if you did go and look at her program, her electoral program, I mean, it was bone chilling. It was no different from the things that they were saying 10 years ago. And bone chilling also in its boldness in terms of, changing, very key French constitutional rights, like the fact that, you inherit, you transmit citizenship through soil, and not through blood, right? If you're born in France, you're entitled to French citizenship. So these things are foundational, in France, in this country, and she was, proposing, really far-reaching changes. So, she was much smarter about what she said about Putin and what she said about Ukraine. And, she basically massaged all of that. But deep down, it's really still a party that is racist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant. And, I think the big difference with the way that things were when her father was at the head of the party is that there's a lot less of an emphasis on Catholicism, right? So it's a less Christian party, quite the opposite. Her big argument against Islam is, we don't want any religion, in the public realm. But otherwise, yeah, it's a deeply racist, nationalist party.
Yeah, and I mean the mainstreaming, we've so far really discussed what might be considered, endogenous reasons for it, the things Le Pen herself has done. But I also think part of it might be, these exogenous factors like the entry of candidates like Zemmour, who initially, when Zemmour came in with opinions that are more far right than Le Pen herself, it was kind of seen as a problem for Le Pen because that might split the vote for her. And I think the effect it actually ended up having is, because of what turned out to be even more extremist opinions, Le Pen seemed more mainstream, attracted more of the centrist voters that maybe would have otherwise voted for Macron, possibly, and it actually ended up helping her. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, he let's face it, he did steal votes away from her, right? I don't think it wouldn't have changed the result. She still, she would have been in the second round. She just would have been on a higher score, and I still think she would have been beaten, at the end of that second round. Nevertheless, he did take a chunk away from her. And I think, but I do think that, he was so outrageous, exactly as you say, that it made her look more mainstream. And I also think she mainstreamed, but she did mainstream herself on some key issues, even though she didn't, really handle it all that well during the campaign, particularly on Europe. In the last election in 2017, she essentially crashed, because it wasn't clear what she really thought about the EU and whether she was proposing, a referendum on exit, a Frexit. She wasn't clear on where she stood on the euro. This time she'd kind of done her homework and gone more mainstream on that, because she realized that there were no votes to be gotten. But yeah, these exogenous factors, Zemmour is one, and the other one is actually the fact that Macron, I mean, he was reelected and he's a perfectly competent president, but he doesn't win any popularity contests, right? And he is, in a sense, the people who are in power right now in France, however competent, and however pro-European, and I think all of this is crucial at the moment, but they are a particular kind of establishment, and they do not offer any kind of proof of connection or even much care about the plight of very ordinary citizens. And the more arrogant Macron and the more self-assured he comes across, the more ordinary and mainstream a Marine Le Pen figure looks. And there was a brilliant campaign picture where she's sitting in a chair and she has a little cat on her lap, and she basically, she just looks like her Aunt Mabel, right? And that's quite effective, particularly in contrast to, somebody like Macron, who, even self-labeled himself as Jupiterian, right? So, I mean, he basically, sets her up to look very ordinary, which is what she wanted.
Mm. It kind of, it makes me think about how we conceive of, French politics and then try to build models around what essentially are just personalities. And particularly at, the presidential level, people are voting for personalities, not parties, but we still try to think of them in these models. And I mean, one of maybe the sort of mainstream orthodoxy coming into this was this kind of bipolar model, right? Of saying there is an elite and there is those who support the elite, and then there's a sort of a populist sentiment. And then some might say, okay, that's too oversimplified. Let's call it a tripartite model or tripolar model, and say there's a populist left, a populist right, and like Macron's, liberal, democratic, centrist, reasonable, pragmatic sort of middle. And you've kind of said in some of your publications that all these models are a bit of an oversimplification, a bit of a facade. If you were to create one, or really think about these things at sort of a more macro level than just personalities, how would you conceive these? What are the different sort of blocks currently in French politics that are relevant?
So, it's really interesting because, French politics, as you know, we live under the Fifth Republic, five, right? We also had a couple of short-lived empires, and, since 1789, never a dull moment. But, the way that you can summarize this is almost a kind of, a tension between, particularly when you look at the various republics, a tension between those republics that were centered around a strong leader and weak parties, and then, those republics that were centered around very strong parties and a weak leader. The Fifth Republic right now in France is, what people fear more than anything is a return to the Fourth Republic, right, where the parties are just unruly. So when de Gaulle kind of came up with the Fifth Republic, his view was, yeah, none of these parties running amok anymore, right? We need a strong president. So here we have this very strange constitution, and I know this sounds a bit geeky, but it's important because it really explains how populism can arise in France in this kind of personality context. So you've got a strong president, but you've also got, a relatively strong parliament. You've got this weird hybrid. And so, everything is always this fight between whether, the presidential candidate can then emancipate himself or herself from the party and govern in the name of everybody, right, as a president might, or whether he or she would need the support of the parties around them. What we've got right now is that Macron did something in 2017, which is that he basically trashed the party system. He created this movement that basically, got elected essentially through a lot of socialist support. The Socialist Party in 2017 was on 6%. This year it's on below 2%. Right. This is extraordinary. This is a party where just over 5 years ago, the president was from this party. The party was in power. Right. So, it's a spectacular fall from grace. And he's done, he's started to do the same thing to the right, the mainstream right by co-opting them. So right now, we've basically got this situation where people are saying, well, there's an elite vote, as you say, and then there's a populist vote, so the people who are optimistic and, want to move forward, roughly 30% of the population, and the people who are pissed off about everything and, want to trash the system. And that's about, probably about 60% of the population if you leave out people who didn't vote. And then it's true that, but it's true that when you look at it, and when you look at what's happening for the legislative elections, the first round of which is on Sunday, actually, you have something that does look like three parties, right? You have a center with Macron, you've got a powerful radical left alliance, and then you've got a right. You've got a right that is bit mainstream, bit hard right, and so on. And so it looks like we've found a new equilibrium, right? With this center. And I'm just not convinced that that's the case, because Macron hasn't built a proper party. This isn't really a proper center. This is, people who've come in from the right and come in from the left. And if you shake it hard enough, you get something that looks like the center. But, this is not there's no ideology beneath it, right? There's no, or not even an ideology, but there's no doctrine really beneath it. So my sense is that France right now, we are still decomposing slightly, right? And the really interesting election is going to be 5 years from now, because Macron won't be able to run. So if he wants the centrist option to survive, he needs to build a party that survives him. And I'm not sure how much of an appetite there is, because can you really have a party without a leader leading it? And would Macron allow somebody else to emerge in these 5 years to become the leader of the party that he's no longer going to lead? That doesn't square with the Jupiterian, rather arrogant young man that we've all seen. So I'm a little bit skeptical as to whether we can actually see what's happened. We can yet draw conclusions. I think we are at a moment of real transformation, right? The traditional parties, the traditional French parties, have just been decimated since 2017. And there is no, in political science, as we talk about recomposition of the party system. I don't think that anything is recomposing yet. I still think we're really decomposing.
Yeah. When you talk about that, and when you talk about this possibly being a return to the Fourth Republic, it reminds me of that quote by Gramsci, which is, chaos emerges when the old is dying and the new is not yet born.
Exactly.
And I think that might be a good way of sort of summarizing that. But I've read. I want to kind of zoom out for the last question, and there's so much you've written about populism and bits of it that I've read, and I mean, almost anything, not even just your work, but work on populism in general. Whenever I read it, it tends to make me feel bad. It tends to paint a little bit of a sort of a pessimistic view. It's never quite what you'd read on an 8 a.m. TV breakfast show sort of thing, right? And you've kind of described populism not necessarily, at least in the way it is right now, as a transition, as an endpoint, but it's more a transition to an endpoint. And I'm wondering if you could look at that endpoint in a certain way, the way that it's moving. Is there anything optimistic about that endpoint, that any dimension of it where we might actually be better off than we currently are?
Well, so I think that whether it's the United States are a cautionary tale, right, of what happens when polarization really overtakes everything else. But here we have politics that are a bit polarized but also fragmented. In Italy, you've got something that resembles this as well. Not to mention the United Kingdom, right? I think that, first of all, one of the things that populism has really drawn people's attention to, two things. One is that there is an expectation on the part of voters, and there is a need, given the kind of turbulences that we face, climate, COVID, war on European soil, right? War on the EU's doorstep and all of that, but there is a demand for government to be involved. There is a role for the state, right? And that has, and that is, it's partly, the fact that populist voters, or, voters who vote for populist parties, that's the more accurate way of referring to them, are people who are in demand of some protection, right? We cannot just let the market do it, right? If we let the market do it, people's livelihoods get trashed. We end up with what we saw in the United States in terms of steelworks, ditto in terms of the United Kingdom, ditto in terms of Northern France, vast deindustrialization. And I think that was the result of this thought that the market would somehow regulate politics. The fact that voters got pissed off about being left behind, as we say, certainly economically and culturally it's, in a different way. I think that was a really important thing to hear. That there is a role for the state, that there is a role for, regulation and so on and so forth. And, and I hope that, that we've also learned the lesson on what happens when you just let the media, when you completely deregulate media content, right? And then you've got the Fox Newses kind of, emerging. This is all thanks to Reagan, right? So I think that's a really important lesson. The second lesson is that I think populism has taught us the hard way is that politics is not just about being technocrats, right? So aside from the fact that there's a role for the state and a role for government, there's a role for the state and a role for government in a version of politics that isn't just technocratic politics, right? That people need to hear a broader narrative, right? A vision, a vision for their country, that it's not just about technical policies, but it's about politics, about people's perception of what kind of power they have in the public realm, but also over their own lives. And I think, the fact that populism is driven, by really deep emotional charges, right? People are angry, people are outraged, people think that things are unfair. That too is a really important reminder that, you don't govern just through Excel sheets, right? And I think that those are two lessons that it seems to me we have learned. And, and I think the place, and I know that alas, this no longer really applies to the UK, but one of the places where that lesson has been learned most obviously is in Europe, right? Is at the EU level, where, it's still chaotic and cack-handed, stops and starts, and it's 27 member states, right? But at the same time, you have a commission that is now a political actor, right? You have a president of the commission in von der Leyen, and you might like her, you might not like her, but the fact is that she takes positions about what Europe stands for, right? And about European unity and European solidarity and so on. This is new, and even the EU's capacity to deal with people like Orban, for example, right? Even though you always have to negotiate because it's a game of 27 players, right? Even though that's the case, it seems to me that the EU is actually a really interesting case to look at of political learning, in part because, everyone in the EU has thought, well, they saw what happened with Brexit, right? But also even within the EU, there's a kind of learning going on with people saying, hang on, these populists, they're a thorn in our side, but what they also show is they do reveal what people really need from politics, right? And as I said, it's not just about Excel, spreadsheets and quite technical policymaking. It's also about a vision of politics, right? Which had gone, let's face it, it had gone missing. I wish we'd learned this lesson in a slightly less disheveled way, but that makes me optimistic because I think we are learning from it.
Yeah, no, I'm glad we ended on that sort of more optimistic. Dr. Fieschi, incredibly fascinating discussion and a very good time to be having it with legislative elections coming up very, very soon. But no, thank you so much for joining us.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
And to find out more about London Politica, visit our website, londonpolitica.com, and follow us on LinkedIn. And that's all for this episode, folks. Stay tuned, stay safe, and I'll see you next week.